And I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on this hot, summery day, the first one we've had down here in North Carolina. Those days when the temperature and the humidity both exceed 90 make it a good day for sitting in and listening to an informative session like Kevin's going to present to us today. Kevin Ogles has been the grazing specialist here at the East National Technology Support Center since 2005. But before that, he kind of earned his degree there, so working in Michigan as the state grazing specialist, along with serving as a district conservationist, soil conservationist, and even spent some time as a soil conservation technician. So between his education and his experience, we have a great opportunity to learn from what Kevin has to say. So with that, I want to introduce Kevin Ogles as today's speaker on what forage suitability groups are. Go ahead, Kevin. Take it over.
Okay, so we had several requests asking about what are FSGs. This is going to be very basic. A lot of people don't have experience with forage suitability groups, and so we're just going to try to cover just kind of what they are, how they could be used. We're not going to get into the how of doing that. If there's enough requests, we may do one of those kind of webinars in the future. But today we're just going to talk about what are forage suitability groups, and this is going to be pretty East-centric. My examples will be from situation, soils, and pastures in the East. So, what are forage suitability groups? We're going to look at three types of definitions, kind of a big picture definition, a technical definition, and a definition for our planners to use. Okay, here's an ecological site description. There's been some confusion over ecological site descriptions of forage suitability groups. Are they the same? Are they different? Are they related to each other? So this is actually a real longleaf pine wiregrass ecological site description done by Georgia a few years ago. And so ecological site descriptions, without getting into those, but they talk about different reference community, different states, and so forth. And when the site's been very disturbed, like going to cropland or pasture, then that's when forage suitability groups will come into play. And so we could have several forage suitability groups in an ecological site description, and there may be forage suitability groups that could be in several different ecological site descriptions. So they do have a few things related to each other, but they are not the same. They are different. So here's a technical definition. Let me just mention that in 2009, a meeting was held to talk about forage suitability groups and what can we do to get them adopted better to help our planners. And so several people from around the country were at that meeting. And so one of the things we realized was that our current guidance on that, which is in the National Range and Pasture Handbook, Chapter 3, Section 2, very great information. It's almost like be a fantastic like forage management 101 type of text there, but still very hard to tell what to do. Like how would you do a forage suitability group? What's the process? And so there was a task force committee set up. I was on that committee, and so we looked at redoing some of that chapter, editing it, changing it, but we did stick with this technical definition, which is pretty much like the current Chapter 3, Section 2. So it is a group of soils that have similar agronomic properties, and so that the soils in that group are going to support the same forage species, the same yields then of those species, and similar treatment and management of those forages. So it's going to be uniform, like I say, have the same adapted forage plants under the same management. Similar conservation treatments will produce the same results on those forages that are adapted to those soils. And those forages will have very similar potential productivity. Now, from a planter's perspective, they go out to a site to do planting, and so they need to know if the landowner wants to plant some forages for pasture, or they have a hayfield maybe that's worn out, they're going to start grazing it though. A number of situations, or even just existing pasture they want to do some better management on. What can they do in those situations? Well, the planter is going to have to know some things, and so if we had a map like this one, and thanks to Tom Aiken for letting me use this today, but if we had a map like this, the yellow dots would be the soils in one forage suitability groups, and then the soils that don't have a yellow dot would be a different forage suitability group. So that's just kind of getting us in the mode to thinking about that. Well, one of the questions I get asked a lot, typically by our experienced planners out there, district conservationists, some state grazing specialists want to know, why do I need forage suitability groups, Kevin? Do I really need them? As David shared with you in the intro, I was a state grazing specialist, and I remember Jim Cropper asking me if I was doing very much with forage suitability groups, and this was exactly my reply. Well, Jim, why do I need forage suitability groups for anyway? And so let's take a look at that. Do we need them? Why are we emphasizing these? Well, when I was a technician, SoilCon, young DC, being mentored by some older experienced DCs, we'd get ready to do some planning on pasture land, and of course first thing we did was we'd obtain our soils information. So we'd go to the soil survey and we'd get that information. We would determine from what the soil survey told us, well, what are the limitations or maybe special management we'd need to do to grow forages. Was there any growth information? And there typically wasn't in the soil survey. So I had to go to my land-grant university and try to find that information out. And then for yields of those forages, usually all I had from the soil survey at that time was a grass hay yield. So I would figure out what that was in tons per acre, and that was my starting point. And then, of course, when we got to the site, we would begin talking with the landowner, the farmer, about what were their goals. And so then we'd try to match all that stuff up. And we did a pretty good job because my mentor, district conservationist, had been in that county for years, and so they knew about what the forage growth was and what kinds of forages grew on what kinds of soils, just simply from years and years of working on those same groups of soils. So that was very fortunate for me because they told me that. And so when I became a district conservationist on my own, here I was plopped into a different county, and I didn't know any of this stuff. I went to the soil survey and I did these things as I mentioned here, but I wasn't able to get very far on being able to give some good information. I could just give some general information, some general yields for all forages, but it wasn't very soil specific. So again, we're talking about soils, and I'm hoping that you know about soils. If you're NRCS folks, you do. If not, soil survey is a tremendous asset to have in doing planning on land for various reasons besides just conservation. So adapted forage species. So then we'd go out and back then, because I didn't know which ones were adapted in my new location, I would try to look at neighboring farms that were already in pasture if I had been contacted about a farmer that wanted to plant some pasture or start grazing. And so that's what I would do. I'd get the best information I could, again, from the land-grant university and observation. So here's a growth curve or yield distribution, lots of different terms used for it, but it's showing us what cool season grasses and cool season legumes, what their growth might look like in a typical growing season. Now, Jim Garrish did this work at University of Missouri, and sometimes that's some of the only information we got on some issues in grazing is from the work he did there. So you can see where, you know, a lot of the growth takes place early, then it drops off as we get into the hot, dry time of summer, and then kicks back up again in the fall when things cool off again, and perhaps we get some more rainfall. So those growth curves, we would just assume, I assume that's about how forages grew in my county for cool season grasses and legumes. So I use that information. So that's kind of showing you some of the basic parts of a forage suitability group, and we're going to get into some other things here. David, did any questions come in?
Yeah, I had a couple questions come in here, Kevin, that maybe you take a second. Can one particular forage species be utilized in more than one forage suitability group?
Yes, it certainly can, and we'll find that quite a bit with some of the forage species are very widely adapted from very well drained to very poorly drained. An example that, because of invasive reasons, we usually don't recommend as far as planting, but reed canary grass is an example of a forage that has a very wide range, can grow on some pretty dry soil, surprisingly. So, yeah, that can happen.
Well, and then I guess kind of a follow-up to that, how does that affect yield? You know, it seems like you're talking about growth, the growth curves, which means production. Are there differences in potential yield between the different suitability groups?
Yeah, there will be. Some plants they will be naturally deeper rooted, some more shallow rooted. The deeper rooted ones, if we're in a group of soils that has a restrictive layer, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, or maybe certain plants can take some moderate drainage, but they can't take very poorly drained, and so they will either not be there, or their yield will be greatly affected by it.
Okay, well that's all the questions we have for now, Kevin.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. Okay, so now I just want to talk about, and I'm not, I'm sure there'll be some people listening from some of these states. I'm not going to mention state names that have these examples, and I'm not picking on anybody here. This first example is from the state where I was a district conservationist for 10 years, and so I just want to point out some things. You know, states are doing a great job at planning with the information they got, and so that's fantastic. And so here's a state where they've broken the state into zones, and so this happens to be from the north zone, gives you both yields and growth curves, so that could help a planter know about what to expect for the various forages listed there, and when their growth is going to take place, when it's going to be low, when it's going to be growing quite a bit, and so that's a big help in planning. But again, you know, as a DC, I use that number no matter what kind of soil I was on, clay loam, silt loam, loamy sand, everything. I had, as a new DC, I didn't know, you know, well, what are these going to yield on my various soils? So I would just use the number. And so sometimes I was way low, and sometimes I was way high when I was making some suggestions for landowners that I was working with, doing some conservation planning with them on pasture. Here's another example. This is not unusual. This happens quite a bit in the East region and actually in a lot of states where there is one growth curve for the whole state. So this is a statewide growth curve for these forages listed here. They have another table just like it for yields. So they have one yield no matter where they're at in the state. So we know from some of Jim Garish's work and some other land-grant universities that we do have differences in growth between tall, cool season grasses, between cool season legumes, native warm season grasses, or introduced warm season grasses where they grow. So very different growth curves. So it really matters what that growth curve is and what that yield is. That's greatly going to affect how much forage is available for the livestock for that farmer. Here's another state example. Again, nothing wrong with this. A lot of states, they've got all kinds of technical documents and information for their planners to use, that they're going to have so many grazing events in a typical growing season. And so based on the density of their forages there, then they would say, okay, and usually they have a grazing stick or a method to determine the density for their planners to use. And so then they would just know, well, okay, if they started grazing at this height, they'd have this much pounds of dry matter, and that would help them get to their forage animal balance that we use when we do prescribed grazing. Some states are really emphasizing more of a paper system, and so there may not be specific charts other than a table saying, well, if it's this height for this forage, you can expect this much dry matter. And again, that would help them get to their forage animal balance, and they would typically be planning for so many grazing events in a season with so many days recommended rest to keep good ground cover. And so there's nothing wrong with any of these methods. That's great that planners are doing that with the clients that we work with. Going back to those that say, well, why do we need those? Here's a picture from North Carolina, a very experienced district conservationist working with a landowner on grazing lands, on pasture. But I've had some DC say, well, Kevin, you know, the average age farmer is 57 years old. I mean, they're going to know what stuff grows where and kind of how much to expect, and they've been making hay on this ground for years, so they about know the dry matter, and we really aren't going to, you know, be able to help them much with just because we have forage suitability groups. And that would be true in those cases, but I looked at some National Ag Statistics data, and every state has gained new farmers, not necessarily a gain in land, in pasture, but they've gained new livestock producers. And so maybe a bigger livestock producer in acreage has retired or whatever, and the land got split up into more owners. And so we have more and more people with no agricultural background whatsoever that want to know how to manage their land. So they aren't going to be able to just know how much dry matter they're going to get per acre on what kind of soil and that kind of thing. So they're going to need our help. If you put that in combination with a planner who has just gotten to a new location for NRCS, and they don't know, you know, they've just got a statewide yield or a north zone yield, and they may not have anything that has anything to do with forage species, then it becomes very hard for them to know how to help that producer. And so then you've got the planner and the producer just kind of winging it out there. And so we can do better than that. We can produce these forage suitability groups are going to help our planters, they're going to help producers, they're going to be better for conservation. So maybe we should know a little bit more about them. So how are they organized? By major land resource area is we're required by policy to do things, to do our forage suitability groups by MLRAs. Now you can break it down further than that into land resource units, and I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. So first we have these great big broad regions, land resource regions that our agency uses. And so they have, as you can see there, related climate, water, land use, and that's kind of how they've grouped them. If you'll notice where my mouse pointer is, kind of pay attention to this southwest Ohio area. I think this is called the Central Allegheny Land Resource Region. There's another look at it, and again, kind of pay attention to the southwest Ohio area. So now they break it down into their MLRA. So here's MLRA 124. It's in part of Ohio, goes up into Pennsylvania, down into Kentucky. One of the things that I urge people to use is a plant hardiness zone. That's going to help us know if there's differences in plant hardiness zones. We're going to have a different in plants that are adapted to an area just by climate. So it's not only by soils but also by climate that we're able to do some grouping into forage suitability groups. So notice this blue area here. I think the blue is plant hardiness zone 5 and the green is plant hardiness zone 6. So remember that was kind of in the middle of our MLRA 124. Okay, so now here's another map. Those of you that worked on Russell 2 Graze module database, that was done pretty extensively just 2-3 years ago. Well, notice that southwest Ohio area is kind of covered in this green. This is the upper mid-south. The reason I wanted to show you that, if we do get into the how someday of doing forage suitability groups on a webinar, the upper mid-south, all those states involved in the upper mid-south came together and got some agreement on what forages had what yields and what growth curves in that upper mid-south zone, based mainly on climate. But that's fantastic. That's a step closer to getting some better information that's going to be able to help a planter do some planning on pasture, farm specific. Okay, so it's not enough to just know that soils are different. That's what we've got a soil survey for. So when we start talking about forage suitability groups, we need to understand what characteristics in the soil affect forage growth. So we know slope does, drainage class does big time. Going back to that question that David had for me, we got everything from very poorly drained to excessively drained there, and there's only a couple of forages that will grow through all those well. Available water capacity, looking at how much water that soil holds, how fast water passes through it. Those are big important factors for us to group soils together. pH below the plow layer. We can change pH in the plow layer by applying lime, of course, but how do we change it below that plow layer? Pretty hard to do, so we're stuck with the inherent qualities of characteristics of those soils below the plow layer. If they're acidic, they're gonna stay acidic. Frost heave potential, a real concern in the northern half of the east region for certain forages. So if a group of soils tends to frost heave, then that's going to determine what kind of management recommendations we have and forages we recommend. Surface rock fragments, yeah, we've got that in the east. no doubt about it. We've got some boulders, and we've got even smaller fragments that can definitely affect what kind of management we do on those soils, and the percent surface covered is going to affect yield also. CEC and organic matter are kind of getting at the fertility of the soil, its ability to provide nutrients to those forages, so those are important factors. Depth of restrictive layers, kind of mentioned that in answering one of David's questions that he got. So that's important. Where are those restrictive layers? Shrink swell, really important to know if that's going to be a factor or not affecting forages in any particular group of soils. And like I said, we've also got some climate and landscape things that are going to affect our forages. So flooding, if we got flooding occurring, and especially if it lasts a long time, that's definitely going to affect which forages can grow there. We know that, take Timothy. Timothy can take flooding up to 45 days. There's some literature supporting that. So not have to worry about Timothy being flooded. But we know that there's lots of other forages, and what popped in my head was crops, which has been very apparent with all the rain we've gotten this year compared to having almost nothing last year. Like soybeans, that's a cropland use, I realize, but you know, they don't do well when they're flooded for very long. Aspect, not as big a factor as out west, but it becomes a factor actually at the higher elevations, at the shorter growing seasons. If we've got a south-facing slope, we'll actually see different forages growing on that slope versus a northern slope. So it can be a factor in certain situations. For most of the east pasture land, it's not as big a factor as out west. Growing season length, that's a big factor. You know, the tall fescue, we always talk about the fescue belt, and people up north are really fortunate, and I was able to work in a state where tall fescue endophyte infected really wasn't a big factor. It wasn't taken over everywhere, and so it could be controlled. So climate and growing season length really has an impact on where those forages are going to grow. Just going to show you some examples. I want to thank Steve Baker and Bob Hirnschop's now retired, but from both those people and Jeff Glanville too helped me. We worked together on forage suitability groups for Ohio. So this is from an actual forage suitability group that's in draft stage. But here's the soil series that are adapted to this forage suitability group. So there's the number of it there. So a forage suitability group description then is going to help us be able to do some planning, because we want to know what are the agronomic and grazing management information that's going to affect our management. For instance, if we had shallow to bedrock group of soils, then obviously that's going to affect big time. You know, we can't be burying pipe 3 feet deep if bedrock's at 2 feet. We're not going to be able to put posts 3 feet in the ground if the bedrock's only a couple feet down. So those are important things to know. So here's their adapted forages for that forage suitability group talked about in Ohio. So there's the forages there. And actually, I'm the one that miscopied some information here. In MLRA 124, smooth brome grass and birchfoot trefoil mixed in with the grass aren't going to really grow that well in southwest Ohio because of the long growing season length. It's starting to get a little too hot for them. Here's an example of their yield and growth curve, the growth curve information here. So this is the real data from those. One of the things they listed is they use plant codes to list their cool season grasses. So those are codes for orchard grass, tall fescue, and probably smooth brome is what that other code is. So here's some yields with good management. I'll talk about that in a second, but you can see the yields there. Now, those that have read Chapter 3, Section 2 are going to say, well, we thought we had to include low yield, average yield, and high management yield. And you still can do that. When our task force committee got to doing a revision of Chapter 3, Section 2, we came across with the minimum. So at a minimum, we wanted people to put at least one yield with good management. Now, good management, that's not excellent management like Land-Grant University forage plot where they've got all kinds of grad student free labor to keep that in top condition. So it would be with good management. I've talked to several producers, as many of you have, that have done planting on pastures that rarely soil test their pastures. They rarely put any nutrients into them. Some people used to do some nitrogen until that got real expensive, and that's dropped off quite a bit with producers. So good management, I talked to some producers that will lime their soils if they got acidic soils once every 3 or 4 years. They certainly don't do it every year, and they kind of rotate among their different pastures or paddocks. So that's what we mean by good management. When we talk about using those in the MLRA that we're given an example of right away, this blue area, probably something we should have considered is, okay, are we going to get as good a yields, or are we going to have some different species grow in that area of the MLRA, and which forage suitability groups does that affect? And so, again, these are in draft stage, but I just wanted to share what they had so far. So here's some information about that forage suitability group. They're wet due to either high water table or brief flooding. They're very poorly drained, or somewhat poorly drained, so you're not going to see plants that like well-drained soil in this group. Medium to fine surface textures, AWC is moderate to high, not very much slope. Average growing season length 180 days, average rainfall 42 inches. Temperature ranges, mean temperature average 46 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit. So that gives you some background of the forage suitability group we're talking about here. So now we've got everything, all the main parts of a forage suitability group. We got the adapted species, their yields, we got some growth curve information, and then the big thing we want to not forget is the management implications. Again, those examples I gave, is there some restrictive layer? Is it a steep slope that's going to make it impossible to put equipment on to do any type of fertility work or herbicide control or anything like that? So we want to put those kinds of things in the management implications. So forage suitability group implications are important for soil amendment and fertility, for planting recommendations, for siting, fence and laneways like we talked about earlier. We want to make sure we can get that fence post down without running into something major like bedrock, and watering facility and pipeline siting recommendations as well. Real important to make sure we're not putting those things in a situation that we might actually cause things to be worse by concentrating the livestock around a watering facility. So now we've got all this information when this person goes to this farm, all in one place, all in hand, so that they can be able to give some good recommendations based on a lot of good work from a lot of people to be able to help this livestock producer know what to plant or how to manage the forage they've got for grazing. Okay, David, did we have some other questions come in?
Yeah, I had a couple others, and anybody else who would like to type some in, feel free to do that right now. A question about yield determining. How would you go about getting accurate data? Do you have a reference or some ideas there?
Yeah, there's first of all, there's if you can get it, there's always the land grant university information. They don't have their plots on every kind of soil in a state, but if you can find that they've done some plot work on a soil that's in a forage suitability group, then hopefully that should work for most of the forage suitability group. So that's one way. Another way is there's been some work done on trying to take a maximum potential yield and then subtracting based on different soil characteristics and management. Jim Green's done some work on that at NC State, and he's still working on some of that, and also Jim Cropper had done some work, and Jim had passed on some things to me, and I'm hoping to get those, get something worked out together and working with Jim Green to try to get at that. But it's very hard. Sometimes it's hard to get good information on those. And I know Florida's done some work on that aspect as well. So when you start doing forage suitability groups, please feel free to contact us here at the Tech Center, and we can help you get at those yields. But you kind of start out as best as you can, and then you adjust them as time goes by, and you get better information.
Okay. Then that leads kind of to second. When you take a typical state, how many different suitability groups would be typical? Would you have 50? Would you have 5? What would be a typical range, and how would you just start to sort through that?
That's a great question. You know, you go back to the old soil survey talk that I used to be around when we had soil survey people in our office at the field office, and you know, you had lumpers and you had splitters, and so that can definitely happen with forage suitability groups. What I'm seeing so far, and we've got a lot of east states that have started their forage suitability groups. Some people have done their sort for statewide, and some people are doing it by MLRA. And it's okay to do it on a statewide basis, and then you just have to make sure that you plug them in by MLRA. But in both cases, when you multiply it out, what we see is anywhere from 20, I think, is about the lowest I've heard that they've come up with so far. And like I say, a lot of these states are in draft stages. And some of them have as many as 35 or 40 for the whole state. So 7 to 10 per MLRA is not unusual. Those states that have done them by MLRA, that's what they've been coming up with so far. So that's a great question, though, is how many are you going to end up with?
That's all the questions that's all the questions we have for right now.
Okay, now I want to show people some examples here. Let me bear with me here just a second.
Okay, Kevin, while you're clicking around, there was a comment came in that says it's obvious that there's severe limitation of actual yield response for many soils. So what's the ramification of missing the estimate of the yield or the productivity, and how critical is that to estimating or planning a good grazing system?
Yeah, that's a great question. what we found is that, when I showed earlier, a lot of states have a statewide yield. State where I came from, even if it had it in 3 zones, the tough thing there, especially for an inexperienced planter, is like when I started, was, well, okay, it says here that orchard grass is going to yield 3.5 ton everywhere. And so I don't care whether I'm on a very poorly drained soil or an excessively drained soil. All I need to do is say, well, yeah, I think you'll get 3 ton. And so even though these yields are hard to get at, it's better than that. Having it broke into forage suitability groups, obviously an excessively drained soil is not going to be in the same forage suitability group as a very poorly drained soil. And so you'll begin to ferret out differences in yield on those. And so we're getting closer to being able to help that producer be able to reasonably expect on their soils, farm specific, what they could expect. So I know it's disconcerting that we don't have better information, but if we can just get as good as we can, that's the best we can do. Okay, so can everybody see? Okay, I've got Ohio's Forage Suitability Group up here. So you can see all the information there. Just wanted to show people what they might find in a forage suitability group. Again, this is draft, but some of the examples of what a forage suitability group might look like in the former chapter, well, it's our current chapter until we get our revision published. This thing was several pages long. Well, here's one that's 4 or 5 pages long. A lot of the information's in a table format. That makes it easier for people to be able to quickly get to the information they want, what soils are in this forage suitability group. In this highlighted area, I just was wanting to show you that some people even further abbreviate this by using plant codes to save space, and they put it in a table format. I just wanted to show you different ways that this is done. So now again, our group, we're looking at the minimums. People want to do more than this, that's fantastic. But at a minimum, we're going to say that you have to at least break things down into perennial grasses warm season, perennial grasses cool season, perennial legumes cool season, and then breaking them into annuals. Annual warm season grasses, annual cool season grasses, annual legumes, and forbs. So that just shows you there. I'm trying to scroll slow here because I know the feed is going to take a few seconds. So again, I was just trying to show some minimums here. This may not be how Ohio ends up doing it, but they were nice enough to let me go ahead and share some information with you here. So I went ahead and did it by that, although the perennial grass cool season did get broken down into bluegrass timothy together and orchard grass tall fescue. So we do think there's benefit in describing what those yields are, but you may have to put groups together to be able to show, or classes of forages together to show what their yield would be. Okay, I'll give things a chance to catch up. So are those curves are showing okay. So we like this format. A couple of states suggested this, and so we want to be able to show that. We think it's going to be easier for a useful document to be able to show a landowner that instead of just numbers. We do have the numbers down below, but but it's a quick way to see, okay, when is the peak growth of tall fescue and orchard grass, or if you've got native warm seasons like switchgrass and eastern grama grass, when does that take place? So wanted to show you that. And there is some narrative, but it's not real long, where we talk about what are those limitations to the soils. They're going to affect our forage growth. What are the management implications then of that? And then just shows you how to do the documentation. And I put in there in italics, this is examples only. This is not reality. This is, they haven't correlated their stuff with Kentucky and Pennsylvania yet. So they were just getting at a draft stage of these forage suitability groups. And then, of course, you have to have the approval process. Okay, let me see if I can.
Well, while you're going to the next one there, Kevin, what role, if any, does different species or cultivars between, the various species that you have? Would you put one particular variety in one group and take a bluegrass and put it in another group? Is the different species or cultivar?
Yeah, you could. And we've had a few states ask us about that when they've started doing their adapted species to a group. Obviously, one thing comes to mind is there's been a real strong work with orchard grass because it goes so well with alfalfa that there's now a late maturing orchard grass. Obviously, it's going to have a different growth curve. And quite often it will have a different yield too. So yes, if you want to list that cultivar work that's been done and what's available, that's certainly a good idea to do. We do think, and nothing's stopping people from listing every cultivar if they want to of a particular forage. But just keep in mind that the more information sometimes gets more confusing for the landowner. You might just want to use maybe the best documented one or two cultivars of a forage and then go on. Did that address the question? Okay, just quickly here, I wanted to show you, this is Florida's. These are, I think this is in their field office tech guide, so they're getting pretty close to being published for public viewing. So look at this one. I think they might have 6 pages here of information. It's really good information, easy to read, easy to get information quickly. See how they put their forages and yields in a table. And then I'll stop here in a second and let the buffering catch up or whatever. So there's their growth curves. They were one of the first states to suggest we do that and suggest that for states to use. So again, same thing we saw with the Ohio one, and I like that. It's able to quickly get an idea of when that major growth and yield takes place. Okay, here's their section showing the physiographic features of the soil, their climate information, their soil property information. They listed more here than Ohio. That's fine. You can do that. Here's the precipitation and temperature information. Very important to know. It's just a big factor when we start talking about minimum temperatures and maximum temperatures on what forages will grow where and how well they will grow. And then they show all the great documentation, all the great work they did to gather information to do their forage suitability groups. And then they have a couple of appendix. Their meat of theirs is the 4 pages long like Ohio's was, but then they do a good job of having a couple of appendix of their map unit list. Let me just show you this last thing. and then their climate stations, where they got their climate data from. So these, like I say, I want to thank Ohio and Florida for letting us use these today to kind of get information on their forage suitability groups and show what states are almost done with them, what they look like. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if there's any further questions, David.
Yeah, again, remember, if you have any questions of Kevin or comments you want to make, be sure to type them in the notes section, and I'll be happy to convey those. I have one come in here, Kevin, and I hope I can catch this right. It says that the forage suitability groups will help planters get in the ballpark on the potential productivity and management for the site, but they're wondering if there's something in here that would help the planter to estimate the productivity under the existing management, so going from a low management to a high, or some kind of a decision, help them make a decision whether they want to invest in that type of a thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. What we've seen, and what I've done when I've helped, Michael Hull and I used to go out and sometimes we had a situation where we had to help a specific producer in a state, and there's some things we can use. There's quite a bit of data out there saying that if somebody's in a continuous grazing situation, they're probably reducing their potential yield by half. So 50% loss of what they could be getting for yield. That's one rule of thumb that we've used a little bit on. Another thing is if they've got same soil, and this is not uncommon in the southeast or northeast, is people will have a hay field. That is their hay field, and quite often they never graze it. And so a lot of times we'll say, well, what kind of yields were you getting off of your hay? And so we can use that in saying, okay, well, we know here's what we could get, and then we go back to saying, well, under the situation, looking at these plants, we'd say you're getting about this much. And again, we use that rule of thumb of the 50% if it's continuous grazing. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're doing what we might call slow rotational grazing, and so we do the best we can. If there's a fence row that the animals haven't gotten to in grazing for whatever reason, I'll try to take some measurements there. Sometimes if we can get to a particular paddock just before they go in to graze it, we'll do some measurements there, much like some of those states I showed in the first part of the presentation. So you do your best in saying, well, okay, there's about this much, and so we think that would equate to about this much per year based on how many grazing events you're doing with your system here now. And so, again, we're working on something. I know that doesn't help anybody today, but Jim Green's been working on some stuff, and we're working on some things, and we're going to try to get together and see if we can come up with something that would help people. How do you figure out where your yield is today, and then how to get to your potential? So great question. We're, again, just kind of doing the best we can.
So to summarize that one, there are things in the works that would help someone understand that if they change this management practice, they can improve the forage suitability on these particular plants X amount to be determined. Okay, that sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
Another question came in. This is more what kind of time frame are states under to get their suitability groups established? And the follow-up was, don't they need to have the ESDs and the NASA data complete before they do that, or can they just go ahead and do the suitability groups without this information? Yeah,
good question. Well, first of all, there's been no official deadline. However, as we would bring in different people to our task force group that was working on forage suitability groups, And so when we would bring in people from CDSI, when we'd bring in people from NRI, they would tell us that, well, people don't have to have their forage suitability groups done, but the sooner they have them done, it's going to make a step just that's much quicker when they're doing things in the future. And so there's placeholders in CDSI for forage suitability groups. There's placeholders in NRI for forage suitability groups. And so it will make things a lot better and a lot quicker for the planner versus not having them and having to come up with something through their own means or their own state's work, trying to get it for a farm specific. So no, there's no deadline, but it's going to be very advantageous to have them done. You don't have to have forage suitability groups done to do ESDs, and vice versa. You don't have to have ESDs done to do forage suitability groups. There's a lot of things that would be helpful for both of those. Soils is going to be used as a basis for both, so obviously that's if you're doing sorts for forage suitability groups, then while you're in that mode of working with soils and that kind of thing, then it'd be real easy to jump into sorting soils for ESD purposes. So, but and I know this because we've got soils for even outside our region that I've talked to that have one or the other, but they don't have both, and they haven't even started working on the other one yet. So, you don't have to have one done before the other, but anyway, so there is no deadline to have forage suitability groups done.
Okay, and that's got one or two more questions, and then we'll call it a day there, Kevin. They wanted, do you know if they're going to add the forage suitability group to the web soil survey, similar to what they've done with the ecological sites and their thematic maps?
Great question. Yes, here's the complete process that would be done is, say a state gets their forage suitability groups done. They not only publish them in their field office tech guide. Now, when I say they got them done, they've been approved by everybody they're supposed to be approved of by usually their state conservationists or state resource conservationists, and so they're ready to go for planners to use. Not only would they be published in the field office tech guide, they could be published. We could get that information published into ESIS, Ecological Site Information System, and then from there it would be available through the web soil survey. And so that would be a way to get the information out to the public. So there is a process that you go through, and North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and I think Texas have gone through that complete process where they've got theirs available by web soil survey now. So yeah, that people will get theirs. They get their forage suitability groups done, and again, we can help people, David, with that if they got questions. Okay,
and we'll cut the questions off with this one, and this is a question about a county that's within one MLRA but has 3 different climatic zones to deal with. They're wondering how can you alter the production outside of the MLRA data or adjust it to make it more applicable.
Yeah, and we've actually worked with states where they've ran into that situation. So your forage suitability groups within that MLRA, if they don't take into account those different zones, usually they will, but sometimes you run into a situation where you need to do that LRU I talked about, the land resource unit. So if you take them down into a smaller area, that can be done. Again, we don't want our committee felt that it would be wrong to break every MLRA down into many different sub-areas, because back to that lumper and splitter thing, we don't want to end up with 40 or 50 forage suitability groups per MLRA. We'd still want to keep them generalized. Some states have actually, David, when they've found a unique difference, maybe it's just one ridgetop in a small area, they have done a forage suitability group for that area and then put in a special note that if you're in the ridgetop area of county so-and-so or these townships, then you need to consider this kind of a thing. So, yeah, lots of ways to address that.
Well, I think you kind of highlighted that one small area in southeastern Ohio is probably a good example of what you're doing there. Well, listen, Kevin, why don't we close off the questions? I appreciate your insights and comments. It sounds like forage suitability groups would be beneficial, and it's like anything, people need to get out of it what they put into it. And I think that's kind of probably the take-home message there. So with that, I'm going to say thanks again and turn it back over to Holly.
Well, thank you, David and Kevin. Kevin, for a very insightful conversation about forage suitability groups. And I think that about wraps things up. Thanks, everybody, and we look forward to having you join our next event.